Welcome to topic 5. This is titled Business Economics, and this topic is all about helping you understand the domestic and global marketplace that most modern businesses operate in. So from your reading you would have got a nice introduction into some of the key economic elements that managers need to consider when they're looking at different marketplaces, both domestically and internationally. But in terms of the lecture outline, the idea of this lecture is to take you through some of the key elements that we'll be using later on in the course, some of the key economic concepts we'll be using later on in the course. So the first one is inflation. Inflation is very important these days because not only does it impose significant costs if it's too high, but it's really the target of monetary policy. Both in Australia and most developed countries use monetary policy to target inflation. So because monetary policy involves interest rates moving up and down, having an understanding of inflation and the causes of it and what causes it to change over time is very insightful, because then you'll get a better understanding of why interest rates change and ultimately later on in the course how those interest rates actually change. So what I've got here is a graph of inflation over around about 50 odd years for both Australia and the United States, and you can see that the general trends in inflation between Australia and the United States have been quite similar. We had very high inflation in the 1970s. Prior to that, inflation was very moderate throughout the 1950s and 60s, but in the early 1970s we had an oil price shock, and oil prices increased. They went close to tripling in the 1970s. We had another oil price shock in the early 1980s. So with oil prices rising, the production costs of companies increased, and that then led them to increase their prices. The interesting thing, however, here is that oil prices did go up significantly, but they didn't stay high forever. They did decrease back down in the mid-1970s, but inflation stayed stubbornly high. Same with the 1980s. There was another oil price shock in the 1980s, and inflation right throughout the 1980s, apart from a little bit of a dip there in about 1984 in Australia, inflation stayed stubbornly high. Now, the reason for that is the third dot point down here on the right, the importance of inflationary expectations. What research has found is that inflation has inertia built into it. So what that means is that if we have had 10% inflation for the last 3 years, we begin to expect 10% inflation. Because we expect 10% inflation, we all begin acting in ways that actually deliver the 10% inflation without any fundamental economic reason underlying that, apart from we simply expect the high inflation. So for example, if you're a worker and you've experienced 10% inflation over the last handful of years, you're going to go into your employer and ask for a 10% wage increase at the beginning of the year. Chances are you'll be granted that, because your employer will be expecting the prices of their goods and services that they produce, or that you produce for them, to be going up by 10%. So if everything's going up by 10%, all of the relativities stay the same in terms of prices and costs, so you're likely to get that 10% wage increase. As I've already indicated, if you are running a business, then if you believe that inflation is going to be 10%, chances are you will adjust. In the absence of any other information, you will increase or adjust your prices upwards that you charge at the beginning of the year by 10% as well. So it's a very simple way of looking at it, but it's reasonably accurate in the way that inflation actually is driven by inflation expectations. So if we expect high inflation, chances are we'll get it, simply because we act in a way that delivers the high inflation. Then something happened in the early 1990s, and you can see both in Australia, the green line, and the pink line, the US. Don't worry about the expected inflation line, the purple line. But in both countries, both Australia and the US, inflation was brought under control. Now, in the early 1990s in Australia, in 1991, we had the recession we had to have. That was the term used by Paul Keating at the time. And a big part of the reason that we had to have that recession, and that did involve pushing interest rates up on mortgages to 18–19% at the time, a big part of the reason we had to have that recession was because inflation was too high. And you can see prior to the early 1990s and the late 1980s, inflation was stubbornly high at 6, 7, 8, even 9%. So that was too high. And you will be doing some reading about the costs of high inflation. So once you understand the costs of high inflation, you'll understand why the government or the central bank at the time actually increased interest rates because of this high inflation. Now, this high inflation, which led to very large increases in interest rates right across the country, pushed Australia into a recession in 1990-91. That saw the inflation rate, the green line, fall in around about 91-92 to between 0 and about 2%, and it hovered around that very low level for quite some time. Australia came out of the recession in 91-92, but inflation didn't bounce back up to the high levels that we had seen in the 1980s, the 1970s. And the reason for that is that the central bank, after the onset of that recession in 1991, introduced something called inflation targeting, which is my second dot point. And this was first introduced in New Zealand, and it was so successful in New Zealand in the early 1990s that other countries around the world began to adopt it. And inflation targeting is simply when the central bank of the country makes an announcement of a numerical band that it is going to target in an attempt to keep inflation within that band. Now, in Australia, the inflation target that we have is 2 to 3%. And what you can see there is that over time, since the early 1990s, the Central Bank of Australia, the Reserve Bank, has been incredibly successful in keeping inflation between that 2 to 3% target. Now, the power of that inflation target that I mentioned of 2 to 3%, and the target is different in different countries. Some countries have a target of 1 to 3%. I think I remember seeing one country had a target of 0 to 3%. So it varies country by country, the actual numerical band, what those upper and lower limits are. But in Australia, it's 2% is the lower limit, 3% is the upper limit. But the power of that numerical band, and actually announcing it to the general public, is that it does control inflationary expectations. So once the Reserve Bank, assuming that you have a central bank that is credible and believable, once they announce this inflation target, it's very difficult for people to believe that inflation is going to be 5, 6, 7%. And so if that's the case, if it can control inflationary expectations that way, it's if the inflation target controls inflationary expectations that way, then that goes a long way to actually controlling actual inflation. So by having an inflation target of 2 to 3%, we begin to act in ways, mainly through wage demands, and if we're running a business, the rate at which we put prices up, it actually constrains our behaviour in a way which actually delivers the lower inflation rate that we're expecting. Okay, so in the absence of large shocks to things such as oil prices, or big negative shocks to things such as investment spending or net export spending, in the absence of those big shocks, simply by having an inflation target, it does go a long way to controlling actual inflation. Sometimes we do get into extreme situations where inflation starts to increase above 3% or it drops below 2%, and that's where interest rates need to be adjusted. But having that inflation target does 90 to 95% of the work of keeping inflation under control, simply by having the target. Okay, so the next thing, I've already mentioned why we have a 2 to 3% inflation target. The important thing to notice here is that some inflation is desirable. We aren't targeting zero inflation. No country in the world targets zero inflation. Every central bank in the world targets some small positive level of inflation. That must mean, and it is the case, that some inflation is desirable. Now, an obvious question is, well, why not 4 to 5%? rather than 2 to 3. Why 2 to 3? Well, the answer to that is that central banks around the world believe that there is no additional benefit by allowing inflation to creep up to 4 to 5%. Having a small amount of inflation, 2 to 3%, is enough inflation to actually generate the benefits that inflation produces for an economy. So having it any higher than 2 to 3% is simply not necessary. At the same time, the inflation target is far enough away from 0% because zero inflation, as we'll see in the next couple of slides, is quite undesirable. 0% inflation is a little bit too close to deflation for comfort. So we don't want 0 to 1 as an inflation target because that's a little bit too close to being in a deflation situation. It would be very easy if we had a target rate of 0 to 1% for the economy to actually slip backwards and for the inflation rate to become negative, i.e. for us to experience deflation. So 2 to 3% is about right. It's far enough away from 0% and possible deflation to be comfortable, and any higher than 2 to 3% is simply unnecessary. Now, what I've got down here is the costs of inflation. I'm going to let you read up on those yourself. There are quite a few of them, but I've got a couple of links here to good publications from St. Louis Fed and the San Francisco Federal Reserve as well. So have a read of those and it will just help you understand why inflation is a problem. But just before we go on to the next slide, one important point to make. The question that I've left unanswered is, why is zero inflation undesirable? Now, one reason that I've already given is that zero inflation is a little bit too close to deflation, that is falling prices, and very soon we'll learn why that is a disaster. But ignoring the possible effects of deflation, let's just imagine that deflation was not possible for some magical reason, and zero inflation was as low as we could possibly go. Even in that situation, we wouldn't want zero inflation. We still want some inflation. The reason being is this, or one of the main reasons is this, and this comes out from central bank research that's been conducted around the world into inflation and optimal inflation rates. The reason is this: prices in markets tell producers which goods and services to actually produce. So let's just imagine that we were on a farm and we were producing apples and bananas. And for whatever reason, maybe there's some new discovery about the benefits of apples, the demand for apples increased quite substantially. And the price of apples went up by 10%, the price of bananas only went up by 2%. Now that would be an indicator, an indication to farmers across the country that they should be producing more apples and fewer bananas. And so what we've got there is a relative price change. The price of apples has increased relative to the price of bananas. Now producers, if they believe those price differentials are going to, or that price change is going to be permanent, they will quickly start producing more apples and fewer bananas. So those relative price changes, like I've just described, are an important indicator of what should be produced and where productive resources should flow in an economy. Now, what central banks around the world these days believe is that if there is some inflation, say 2 to 3%, then the economy is freer to actually experience those relative price changes. That is, if all goods are going up at the same, at say 2 to 3% each year, when we do get this shock where apple prices surge by 10% relative to banana prices only going up by 2%, because we've got this history of very low inflation, the markets are just freer to have apple prices jump by 10%. Now, to help you understand that, let me just sort of talk through the opposite case. Just imagine we had zero inflation and prices never increased. In that situation, what central banks believe is that it would be not impossible, but just a little bit more difficult for the prices of apples to jump by 10% in an environment where prices never rise or they rise infrequently. So if we've got some inflation, 2 to 3%, it's simply a matter of markets being able to more easily achieve those relative price changes that I've just been describing than if we had no inflation at all. As I said, I'm not suggesting, and even the central banks that have written about this are not suggesting that zero inflation would make it impossible for relative prices of apples and bananas to change. That's not the case. They are saying if inflation is 0%, that effect is not going to be as efficient or as quick to occur. Okay, so that's inflation. Moving on, we've got deflation now, and on the left I've got a chart which shows the Japanese real estate bubble forming in the 1990s and the Japanese stock market bubble forming in the 1990s as well. Now, this was due to a period of very loose lending standards in the banking system and just a high degree of over-optimism about the future of the Japanese economy. The Japanese had had a very good time in the 1950s, 60s and 70s in economic terms, and there was a lot of optimism about the future. That led to a lot of borrowing and a lot of investment in increasingly expensive stocks and real estate as well. The problem with the formation of these bubbles, which is what we're looking at here in the 1980s, is that once they begin, then people borrow ever increasingly large amounts of money to try to get in on the trade, make money and get out before the whole thing crashes, which this just then causes these sorts of bubbles and these asset price increases to just keep increasing. But what I wanted to do, the reason I'm showing you this is to first of all highlight the crash in real estate prices in Japan. And it's quite interesting to note that housing prices in Japan between about 1985 and 2005, that's a 20-year period, haven't really changed at all. So they've been doing it really tough after the formation of these two bubbles in Japan in the housing market. And the stock market as well fell from the peak of about 40,000 in terms of the Nikkei, and at the end of this graph in around about 2008, prices were around about one quarter of, a little bit more than 1/4 of the peak of about 40,000. So big crashes there. The key thing here, because we're talking about deflation, is the recession, the ongoing recession that the bursting of these two bubbles pushed the Japanese economy into. And down the bottom, we can see two graphs where the central bank policy interest rate for Japan, the red line, was cut drastically from 6% down to close to 0% over the course of the 1990s. And the reason that occurred, you can see over on the, well, first of all, economic growth was incredibly slow over this period. The Japanese economy, and I'm talking about the early 1990s onwards, the Japanese economy was in and out of recession numerous times. One of the big problems with that was inflation, or as Japan experienced, deflation. And if you have a look at the bottom right-hand graph, we've got core CPI inflation here. And from around about 1998 onwards, you can see that inflation became deflation in Japan. And right throughout the 2000s, the Japanese were still suffering from the after effects of these two bubbles bursting, and they were experiencing very slow growth and deflation. So deflation can actually occur when the economy is experiencing very, very weak economic growth. And so then prices across the board begin to fall. So deflation, it has happened very recently, and it'll probably happen again in some country in the not too foreseeable future. Okay, so in terms of deflation, it most often caused by protracted recessions or depressions in countries. However, it can also be caused by very strong productivity growth. So if you've got very strong productivity growth driving production costs and prices down, and there's enough competition and enough markets in an economy, then inflation in such an economy could actually move towards zero and may actually become negative if this process is strong enough. So I don't want you thinking that deflation can only occur during recessions or depressions. It can occur during periods of very strong productivity growth. Now, one of the problems with deflation is that, as in the point number one is indicated in the top of this slide, it could be associated with a recession or depression, although not necessarily. But with prices falling, it does encourage consumers to actually delay their consumption decisions, their consumption spending, and it also discourages investment as well. Just think about it. You're thinking about starting up a new business, you want to borrow money, and the forecast over the next couple of years, 2 or 3 or 4 years, is for the prices of the goods and services you're thinking about supplying to the market to fall. The prices of what you are thinking of producing are expected to fall. It would be a very brave investment to undertake in that sort of situation. Obviously, it would be better to be in a situation where you think that the prices of the goods and services that you would be producing as a new entrepreneur would be increasing over time. So when deflation hits, it very often can be made worse by delaying consumption and investment decisions. I've also got here that deflation terrifies central bankers. Now, the reason for that is that it implies a very high real interest rate. Now, to understand that, we're going to have to go on to the concepts of nominal versus real interest rates. And once we've done that, you'll understand why deflation can mean very high real interest rates. But we'll do that in the next presentation.